Okay, hello everyone. I've been getting a few emails from people asking me about the second assessment, and I thought I'd record this, which is in a way kind of against my principles because quite a few of those people asking have not actually been to the workshop. So obviously, the expectation is that you attend the workshop in which these things have been unpacked. But however, I'm going to go through the rubric. But I'm certainly expecting those of you who haven't been to the workshop to go to the workshops, do the activities that are actually specifically connected to, you know, um, developing your skills for this task. So anyway, as you know, your second assessment task is due on the 26th of May. It's 60%, and the task is that you actually provide an extended analytical response and a learning sequence. And I think out of the two, I think it's part B that throws you more, which is again the workshops. So it is designed to get you to really start looking at this through teacher eyes. You can use your experiences from the Learning Club for both part A and B. You don't have to, but you can. So for part A, you are analysing a writing sample for a particular year level in relation to the current curriculum framework, i.e. the Victorian curriculum. You need to explain your use of assessment strategies to analyse the writing sample and to identify appropriate strategies to support your students' literacy development. This analysis should be supported with references to the relevant learning outcomes and elaborations in the Victorian curriculum. Your assessment strategies will be probably to do quite a lot with formative assessment to inform your planning and the idea of, for example, connecting with feedback. But there's also an element in respect to achieving or assessing the writing sample in relation to the curriculum. So in that sense, you're probably assessing of learning as well to kind of benchmark it against the achievement standards. Again, you need to look at that in the Victorian curriculum. I would suggest that for most purposes, you're just talking about what you've done in order to examine how the student is going and then how that is informing your planning. So a formative assessment consideration. So part A is where you analyse a writing sample. Now that might be a sample that you've collected from Learning Club, or it might be another sample, but I think it makes sense that you're using either the writing sample you were provided with, or if you have got some little snippet that they've developed for you. So for a pass level, you have linked that to relevant curriculum framework that you can see demonstrated, or you're relating what you're seeing and kind of annotating that in connection with the Victorian curriculum. So you need to decide what learning outcomes in what strand you're relating the writing sample to, and then unpack what you're actually finding in that sample. For a credit level, you've got some pretty good links there to the Victorian curriculum. Doesn't mean that you have lots and lots of outcomes, but the ones that you're talking about really make sense. And your explanation is focused. You're showing that you understand the curriculum and how the writing sample connects with that. For distinction, you're showing some good critical engagement, so you're actually making some very good, insightful links. And for HD, you would be quite innovative and come up with something a bit out of the box, but really, really good. You're also talking about what strategies and resources you would use to support your students' literacy development. So that's, again, actually a formative assessment consideration, because you're talking about how, based on the sample, what are you going to do to inform your planning and your teaching and the students' learning. So you will provide some strategies, and I've gone through various strategies in lectures and in workshops. And we've gone through a number of resources as well that you can draw on in order to help explain how you're actually going to, it might be like question matrices or whatever it is that you're looking at using to help this student develop further. In respect to how you split this up, I think most of the part is really your analysis, but then you will also talk about the strategies and resources that you put in, and you put in the resources as an appendix, but you need to unpack them. You can't let them speak for yourself. So you obviously need to explain where you picked those resources and how does this fit in with the idea of developing students' literacy. Okay, for the part B, you're creating a series of learning experiences to support and scaffold literacy development. This sequence should include cross-curricular links, which is what we've spoken about a few weeks ago, and also it's a consideration in today's, or in the recording for this week. Also, effective teaching strategies for Indigenous students and for whom English is not their first language. Again, that's the focus of this week. So you need to provide a key within your sequence to indicate these links and ELD considerations. Within that sequence of probably about 5 lessons, which are not very detailed, but an overall sequence. And again, that sequence is a good idea to probably use the 5E format or model to develop. 2 of the lessons within the sequence need to be developed in detail. So you actually provide lesson plans, and you can use the FedUni lesson template. So you're providing the details. In those lessons, the 2 lessons, you need to include explicit teaching and learning strategies for at least 3 of the following, which include reading, writing, spelling, grammar, oral language, and or visual literacies. And the same task may well connect with the 3 things. It doesn't have to be separate things necessarily. You need to explain which ones you're using and connect that in the rationale, and also obviously include the relevant curriculum outcomes and elaborations. You also need to include assessment considerations, for example, assessment for learning, whether that is part of the success criteria so the student can check that they've met those learning outcomes, or whether it is part of feedback or whatever it is that you're doing. So for part B, you need at least 5 sessions. You can use the table I've put up in the resources from last week. I'll actually show you what that looks like. Hang on, let me just go into that for a moment. I think this is the one I'm thinking of. Is this popping up? Oh, here we go. Right, so let me just, I'm working off 2 screens, which makes it a bit tricky at times. So you might want to use this table for your second assessment, that sequence, where you talk about the 5 phases, and here you've actually got 5 sessions that works in. You put in the learning outcomes or the elaboration indicator from the curriculum. So obviously you will need to decide on what class you're teaching or what grade. And the fact that it's English and something else, might be English and science or English and whatever, that are included in this sequence. Substrands will be things like reading, writing, whatever. You talk about what is it that you're trying to do here, why is this important, and what is that all leading up to. And in fact, that becomes an assessment of learning. How are the students actually going to demonstrate that they're achieving whatever it is that you're going for in your sequence. So you've got the 5E. You don't have to use that, but I would suggest it's probably a good idea. You put in the relevant elaborations and indicators, and then unpack the learning experiences. Explain what the success criteria is, any resources that you're going to use that you put in, again, as an appendix. And here in the other column, I would suggest that you put in things like grouping considerations, whether you're doing it in whole class, small class, or stations, or whatever it is. Also, that's a good place for you to put in your cross-curricular priorities to flag that, and any ELD considerations. So, just going to go back to where I was. So, within that 5 series, I would suggest if you want to use that table, you can, and just put it in the word part, or if you want to write it as ongoing words, if you prefer to do that, doesn't really matter. But you need to provide an overview of a series of learning experiences that support and scaffold literacy development, and you need to include those cross-curricular and ELD connections. For a credit, it's a well-rounded overview, so it flows well, meaning that it's really building and leading up to something. It's not just Groundhog Day and you're starting from scratch. You can see the links and the development. For a distinction, it's logical and well developed. I should say that table, obviously, it's room for you to actually unpack it in more detail. I wouldn't expect it to be a one-page response. You'd probably unpack it in a bit more, even for that fairly brief overview. You're making good use of those cross-curricular and ELD connections. So it's not that you're doing something that's necessarily out of the ordinary. It's just that you're showing an awareness of whatever strategies and whatever activities that you're doing with your class, how that actually fits in with both ELD connections and or cross-curricular priorities like Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander histories. My computer is being silly. Okay. The 2 detailed lessons need to be part of the sequence. So in that table of the sequence, you might say unpacked in more detail in the lessons. So you're kind of flagging which ones are fitting in. And in those lessons, you're providing, again, a rationale. You're including the learning outcomes, assessment for learning considerations, the explicit learning modes and strategies you're going to use, and any resources. So for a pass, you're providing at least 2, or you're providing 2 lessons which sufficiently address 3 aspects of literacy, and you have got a rationale, learning outcomes, AFL considerations, and those other parts included. If you're missing one of those, then you're not a pass. For a credit, they're well-developed lessons. You're showing some insight there in how you're going about it. You're explaining it nicely, how these things that you're doing actually address aspects of literacy. For a distinction, it's really well developed. It's explicit. It's connected in a really tight manner. So it's the level of how you actually go about it, how engaging your activities are and interesting in that they're really meeting the learning outcomes that you're identifying. Pay attention to the verbs in the elaborations and make sure that you're actually providing your students the opportunity to demonstrate those skills in the learning sequence and in the success criteria, so that it's a nice connection and constructive alignment, as we say. So that's it. Now, I'm not going to go through a lot of detail. If you have not been to the workshops, make sure that you've got all the resources up on Moodle. So go through it and, take care.